I have rather diverse, rather eclectic tastes in entertainment, shaped by different parts of my life. When I was in high school, I fell in love with musical comedy. When I was in college, I fell in love with Shakespeare. But some of my interests in entertainment really were formed as a child. And I've mentioned before how my grandfather, my mother's father, Teddy Roosevelt Trollinger, and yes, he was named after President Roosevelt. My grandfather, Teddy Roosevelt Trollinger, was the one who, on a weekly basis, took me to the drugstore to buy comic books. They were 12 cents back then. And how that created this lifelong love and collection of comics that I have to this day. I've talked about that. I haven't mentioned probably his wife, though. My grandmother, my mother's mother, Murray Trollinger. Now, my grandmother had a stroke, a very serious stroke, when I was 6 years old. And it paralyzed her and left her unable to talk. And so my memories of her are very faint, only up to about the age of 6. As a matter of fact, I have one dominant memory of my grandmother Trollinger. And here's the memory I have of my grandmother that I think had some impact on me. We are sitting in the living room of my grandparents' house. My grandmother, who was a pretty large woman, is sitting on the edge of her chair, and she is watching a little black and white television set, one of those like 12 or 14-inch black and white TV sets, and she is yelling at the television at the top of her lungs, agitated and angry and upset, yelling at the television because my grandmother is watching professional wrestling. Now, this is in the 60s, where it's a lot different back then than it is now. This is before the WWE and all that stuff. This is when wrestling was much more regional. Every area had their own group of professional wrestlers. And so this is the days that only a handful of you will know these names: Cowboy Bill Watts and Skandar Akbar and Danny Hodge. And these are all old or dead guys now. But my grandmother was watching professional wrestling, and the reason she was yelling at the television was because the referee did not see how the bad guy was cheating. Because, of course, the referee had his back turned while the bad guy, which in wrestling lingo is the heel, okay? The heel was doing illegal tactics, and the referee was not catching him, which is, of course, something that happens in professional wrestling all the time. But my grandmother was completely bought into all this. She was all in, and she was so agitated that this injustice was happening in the wrestling match. And I was drawn in to that because this was almost like a comic book come to life. I mean, good guys fighting bad guys. Now, I mention that because our scripture today is about wrestling. It's about a wrestling match. But it is not like professional wrestling that is, shall we say, scripted, nor is it like the wrestling that we see when OU or OSU has a wrestling match and it is legitimate, a different kind of wrestling or the kind we see in the Olympics. The wrestling match that's described in the book of Genesis is clearly a mismatch because it's a man versus God, which you think that's not going to be a very long match, man versus God. Now, I'm going to be talking this year about some turning points and some crossroads in people's lives. And no one has a bigger crossroad or turning point in his life than Jacob. And Jacob is one of the most fascinating characters in the Old Testament because if Jacob was a professional wrestler, he would definitely be a heel, the bad guy. Because if you've ever watched or any kind of professional wrestling, you know the bad guys, the heels. And by the way, they're the ones who draw the crowds. People don't come to watch professional wrestling to see the good guy win. They come to see the bad guy lose. They get all interested in him getting his comeuppance. And so the bad guys, the heels in wrestling, are always cheaters and schemers and liars and cowards. Like my favorite all-time bad guy, Roddy Piper, the greatest wrestling villain probably ever. Well, Jacob was a heel. Jacob was a bad guy. He was a cheater. He was a liar. He was a schemer. He was a coward. He was everything that we dislike. He's all of those things. we read about Jacob's story, and he's very unlikable. His grandfather, he comes from a great family. His grandfather is Abraham. I mean, what better pedigree is that? His grandfather is Abraham, the man that God chose to be the patriarch, the father of a holy nation, a holy people, that God picked of all the men on earth to be the father of his people. Jacob's father is Isaac, and the promise goes from Abraham to Isaac. But then we come to Jacob. Jacob is the black sheep. Even his name, Jacob, means grabber, means usurper. Even his name says something about his character. Now you remember that Jacob is a twin. He is the younger of two twin brothers. His older brother, older probably by a minute or two, his older brother Esau, his twin brother, was athletic, an outdoorsman, and a hunter, and not terribly bright. Jacob was not an outdoorsman, he was an indoorsman. He's described as a man of the tents. He liked to stay in the tent and cook and plot and plan and scheme. His next con. He was always trying to look out for himself, always trying to find a way to enrich himself. And you probably remember the couple of stories about that. When his not too bright older brother Esau came back from a hunting trip that was unsuccessful, his brother was starving. And Jacob was cooking some stew. And his brother said, "Give me some of that stew." And Jacob says, "Well, you can have a bowl of stew if you'll sell me your birthright," which is the privileges of being the eldest son, which meant a double portion of the inheritance, which meant being leader of the family. And stupid Esau trades his birthright for a bowl of stew. And Jacob spins his web. Later on, Isaac is dying. He's old and he's senile and he's blind and he's on his deathbed. And he wants to give Esau a special blessing that in those days carried a lot of weight. But Jacob pretended to be his twin brother, lied to his poor blind father, said, "I am Esau," blatantly lied to his face, and stole the blessing from his dying father. Jacob was not a good guy. And when his older brother Esau found out about this latest scheme that he'd stolen now the blessing as well, Esau vowed, "As soon as our dad is dead, I'm going to kill you." And he didn't mean it, he meant it. As soon as dad dies, I will kill you. Jacob knew his brother meant business. And so Jacob hightailed it out of here. He left to head for the safety of his uncle's house, his mother's brother Laban. And so he heads and he leaves the family home and he heads for his uncle's house, which was several days' journey away. And on his way to his uncle's house, as he's sleeping in the desert, he has a vision. And this vision is weird. And some translations call it a stairway and some call it a ladder. So whichever it was, he had the vision of a ladder or a stairway with angels going up and angels going down this stairway or this ladder. And at the top of the stairs or the top of the ladder was God himself in this vision. Now, this vision that Jacob has in the desert, that's often referred to as Jacob's ladder, has inspired a lot of artwork. There's hundreds of paintings of this. Some of you remember the old gospel song, "We are climbing Jacob's ladder, we are climbing Jacob's ladder." That goes back to it's a Negro spiritual, going back to the Negro slave days. You're probably more familiar with the more popular song, Led Zeppelin's "Stairway to Heaven," considered by some to be the greatest rock anthem of all time. Not to mention one of the most devious devices at the gym called a Jacob's ladder, where you climb and climb and climb and never get anywhere. So all of these things, paintings and songs and exercise equipment, all inspired by this vision of the angels going up and down a ladder or a stairway. And in that vision, God says, I made a promise to your grandfather, I made a promise to your father, and now, this holy nation, it's going to come through you. He's trying to say to Jacob, I want you to be a part of this covenant promise. And here's Jacob's response. Genesis 28:21. Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I'm taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God. Not exactly the most ringing, heartfelt prayer you can imagine. God, if you will give me everything I want, then you can be my God. If you give me everything I want, then I will allow you to be my God. That's got to be the most lukewarm response to God that we have of a major figure in the Bible, because it shows his character. Jacob was all about Jacob. Jacob was all about himself, all about looking out for number one. He gets to his uncle's house, and in a fairly funny part of the book, we find out that his uncle is just like him. His uncle is also a schemer and a trickster and a con man, and the two of them spend 20 years trying to outdo each other and trick each other. And in the meantime, Jacob ends up marrying two of his cousins, two of his uncle's daughters, one that he's madly in love with, Rachel, one that he doesn't like at all, Leah. He gets tricked into marrying her, and that's a whole other story. They get into a contest, the two women, as to who can produce the most babies. And when Rachel isn't able to produce a child, she enlists her handmaid to have a child for her. And yes, that's where the TV show, The Handmaid's Tale, gets its backstory too. So it's a twisted family relationship that he has. But over 20 years, he builds a family and builds wealth. And after 20 years living with his uncle, he now has 2 wives, 2 handmaids, and 11 sons, and 1 daughter, and servants, and cattle, and donkeys, and sheep, and goats, etc., etc. He decides it's time to leave. It's time to head back home, thinking, surely after 20 years, my brother has forgotten about all of this. So he starts to head back home, and he gets word that his brother Esau is coming to meet him with 400 armed men. So he gets to the river. And being the cowardly heel that he is, he sends his wife and kids out in front of him, and he stays behind. He sends his family to meet the brother and the armed men while he stays behind. And that's where the wrestling match occurs. Now, how does a man wrestle God? How does that happen? If we're to take this as a literal physical match, like in the WWE, it would take about a nanosecond for God to pin a human. I don't think that's the kind of wrestling match we're talking about. The only one who could report on that is, of course, Jacob himself. As I think I've said before, have you ever said, I spent the night wrestling with God? I spent time wrestling with God. I know I've spent a few nights wrestling with God. Wrestling with what I knew he wanted me to do and what I wanted to do, and they weren't the same thing. Wrestling with what I felt like God was calling me to do that I didn't want to do, or the thing that I wanted to do that I knew God didn't want me to do, or on and on. I think I've spent some nights wrestling with God. And however we understand this wrestling match, physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever, however you really understand this, it goes on all night long. Until finally at daybreak, it ends, and Jacob's hip gets put out of joint, and this man or angel or God himself says, I'm going to change you. I'm going to change your name. And we are told that Jacob felt like he had encountered God. Genesis 32:30 says this, Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it's because I saw God's face to face. and yet my life was spared. Peniel means the face of God. But in this wrestling match, Jacob is changed. After a night of wrestling, God tells him, I'm going to change your name. He's going to change his name from Jacob, the grabber, the usurper, to Israel. Israel, which means literally, wrestle with God. I'm changing your name, Jacob. I'm changing your name to wrestle with God. This is a turning point in Jacob's life. I have a feeling that night, a lot of thoughts were going through Jacob's mind, thinking about his wives and his children out there about to face his brother, thinking about why they were about to face his brother, how he had cheated his brother over and over, how he had lied to his father, how he had been a schemer and a plotter all of his life. And somehow in that, there came a change. God wrestles with him and he changes. Rather, he is changed by an encounter with God. Now, if we were to use wrestling terms, at least professional wrestling terms, and wrestling is basically soap opera for men, there are times, to make the story more interesting, where a good guy changes and becomes a bad guy. The good guys are called the faces, the baby faces. The bad guys are called the heels. So sometimes a good guy actually becomes a bad guy. That's called a heel turn. The best known heel turn of all time was when the heroic Hulk Hogan became a bad guy. When Hulk Hogan became Hollywood Hogan, the biggest heel turn in wrestling history. But sometimes it happens in reverse. Sometimes a bad guy becomes a good guy in wrestling, and that's called a face turn, when the heel becomes a face. That's what happens to Jacob. Jacob has a face turn. Jacob, the heel, becomes a good guy, or at least a much better guy. He reconciles with his brother. He goes out to meet Esau, and instead of Esau attacking him, the two reconcile, the two embrace. Jacob tries to give Esau flocks and sheep and property to make up for all that he'd taken from him. And Esau says, I've got plenty, brother. And they part, reconciled. Now, does Jacob suddenly become a perfect person? Does Jacob suddenly become a great, great man of God? No, it doesn't happen overnight. And he doesn't become perfect. Matter of fact, as you read the story, he's not a great dad. He plays favorites way too much with his sons. But Jacob stops the lying, and he stops the cheating, and he stops the scheming. He becomes a different person. And maybe the best sign of that is what happens a couple of chapters later. And this is not as dramatic a story as the stairway to heaven or the wrestling match or some of the other things that happen. But in chapter 35, Jacob goes back to the place where he saw the stairway, where he saw the ladder. A place that he now names Bethel. Beth-el. Beth means house. El always means God. Beth-el, house of God. He calls the place Bethel, house of God. He goes back to Bethel. And here's what he says to his family and his servants in Genesis 35:3. Come, let us go up to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I've gone. He looked back over his life and said, even when I was a heel, even when I was Jacob, even when I was not a good man, God never abandoned me. God never stopped working on me. God never stopped wrestling with me. God never stopped drawing me to himself. God never gave up on me. He's been with me wherever I've gone, even in my times of distress. Let's go and worship him. Let's go and worship him. Now, when Jacob, also known as now Israel, when he had that wrestling match, he was not a young man. If you just add up the years of his life and all of that happened, he's my age or older when he had this wrestling match. He's not a young guy. But he changes. And that tells me you're never too old to change. No matter how old you are, you're never too old to change. It's never too late to change. It's never too late to wrestle with God and let God work on you and shape you and change you and mold you and transform you. It's never too late to change your habits. And I'm not talking just about the New Year's resolution kind of habits. I mean the habits of your life. I mean your priorities, the things that you value the most. It's never too late to change your priorities. It's never too late to change a relationship in your family. You may say, well, I never talked to that brother. I never talked to that sister. I'm not ever going to talk to my parents again. There may be a relationship. You said, well, there's never going to be reconciliation. Well, never's a long time. Things can change. It's never too late for reconciliation. It's never too late to mend a friendship. It's never too late to change your behavior. It's never too late to say, I've been struggling with this addiction or this thing that is a handicap in my life that I know that keeps me away from God. It's never too late to say, I'm getting rid of this thing that's holding me back. It's never too late to change. I don't know, when you think about the times in your life that you've wrestled with God. There's an old story of a fellow who went to visit an old saint who'd been faithful, and this old saint, he asked the saint, the saintly person, the saintly man, what are you doing? And he says, well, I spend a lot of my time wrestling with God. And the young fellow's like, wrestling with God? And he says, do you hope to win? And the fellow said, no, I hope to lose. When you wrestle with God, your prayer should be, oh, Lord, let me lose. Let me lose this wrestling match with God. Let him pin me down. Let him get a hold of me and transform me. Let it be, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Not my will be done. Thy will be done. Lord, let me lose that wrestling match to you. Because when we lose a wrestling match to God, when we let him be the victor, then in God's wonderful economy, when we lose to God, we win. When we let him triumph over us, we win. Let's pray.